Hello, and welcome to today's live chapter reading of The Prospect of Death by Carmen Radtke, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, 29th of July, 1862. Hammer blows startled the birds into protesting flights. 5 men slid freshly sawn planks 3 boards wide into an orderly row, wedging each one in good and proper. Half the men in town had found excuses not to leave for too long, since they'd had word that their brides should arrive in Canada any day now. Nobody wanted to miss the moment when the first females ever to set foot in this place came ashore. They'd waited almost a year since their late pastor came up with the crazy idea of shipping over a gaggle of poor, hardworking girls from Australia. A fever had gripped them back then, with big plans for a proper town to call home instead of moving on wherever there was gold. It separated the men into 2 groups: the homebodies, who readily parted with their cash to stake their claim, and those who feared for the freedom of their ways once females moved in and joined the next pack train into the wilderness. A handful of men stayed out of the discussion, kept what was theirs, and waited to see what would happen. Money. It had taken a lot of money to pay for the skirts' passages and to spruce up Run's End, but then everything did. All you needed was patience. Patience and luck, or in his case, a good plan and a cool head. A few more months, that was all he needed to make his luck, or let the others make it for him. The evening bell interrupted his thoughts. The men downed their tools, slapping each other on the back in unbridled happiness. Land, after all these endless months at sea. Alyssa Chalmers hurried down the wooden gangway, but her knees gave in after 2 steps on firm ground. A firm hand grasped her waist at the last moment. "Steady," said Mr. Kendrick, first officer of the Artemis Delight, the ship that had carried them from Melbourne. "That goes for all of you ladies." Indeed, most of the girls had by now made the same discovery as Alyssa, that their legs betrayed them. Nancy and Susanna clung together with a little cry that turned to laughter when they found themselves unceremoniously sitting on the rock-hard earth. Gray dust swiveled around them in a shimmery column. Alyssa smiled too. Canada! After all the storms and seasickness, they'd arrived. She sucked the salty air deep into her lungs. It carried the crisp tanginess that she'd grown accustomed to, but instead of being mixed with the stink of burning coal, there was an almost forgotten scent at its heart. It smelt of life and hope, of a fresh start. She gazed around, rapt. A cluster of trees appeared as dark silhouettes against the backdrop of a long warehouse. Someone blocked the sun. Mark Bryson, the ship's surgeon, made his way towards her with barely a glance for anyone else. Mr. Kendrick let go of Alyssa with flattering slowness. She'd barely noticed his presence any longer in her excitement to see trees again. To her surprise, the doctor gave them a regretful shrug and walked on. By now, all 21 girls stood more or less firmly on the sun-bleached ground. Their chaperone, Matron Mackenzie, fished a list out of her reticule and with a sigh of relief ticked off name after name. Her task as a stern guardian, nurse, and moral guide was almost over. Beside her stood the second officer, Mr. Wainwright. Every so often, Matron would glance at him from under her bonnet and meet his slow smile. Laughter rose in Alyssa's throat. How wonderful to stand on a pier again, free from the confinements of the ship and the tyranny of the wind and waves. She stretched her arms as wide as they could and let out a happy little cry. "Alyssa," her friend Hannah said, "people are staring at you." Alyssa sighed as she dropped her arms. "Aren't you happy?" "Yeah, but you know how upset Matron gets when you do odd things." Not just Matron, Alyssa thought. Although Mrs. Mackenzie had readily accepted Alyssa's assistance and let her teach the other brides how to read and write properly and do their sums, she still fretted over Alyssa's too free behavior. A young, well-educated lady of good family was someone she could not treat the same way as Matron would a girl like Rosie, who with her loose morals and meanness was a constant burden. Alyssa's friendship with the doctor and the first officer, on the other hand, was a fact that Matron readily accepted as the logical outcome of a sea voyage where Alyssa's nursing skills had been tested when seasickness laid low half the brides, most of the male first-class passengers, and several crew members. Hannah prodded her. "Stop daydreaming," Matron's finished. Sorry. Alyssa waited for a sign of what to expect now. The 5 male passengers still stood on deck, while all the luggage sat in the hold or cabins. The sun's warmth seeped into her bones. A few more hours until dusk. Where would they sleep tonight? Matron must have wondered too, because she beckoned Mr. Kendrick. She whispered into his ear with an unaccustomed urgency, but his answer seemed to please her. She clapped into her hands for a second, for attention. Girls, she said, Mr. Kendrick has informed me that we are all invited to a celebratory dinner in Fort Victoria. Loud gasps interrupted her. She clapped again. If you will follow Mr. Kendrick in an orderly fashion, he will take us to the hotel. A hotel? Red-haired Susanna asked. But our dresses. I sat in the dirt. She craned her slender neck in dismay to survey the bedraggled appearance of her skirt. Let me help you, Alyssa said. She patted the faded material until a small dust cloud rose from it. Susanna wrinkled her nose. I've never been in a hotel before. If Matron had told us, we'd have put on our good dresses. There'll be more opportunities to dress up, Alyssa said. Besides, no one will notice a speck of dirt on your skirt, especially if they looked at her face with its sparkling blue eyes and the dimples in her cheeks. Yeah, Susanna's mood lifted. Imagine food that we don't have to cook ourselves. She linked her arm with Alyssa's, decidedly upbeat. Heavy footsteps fell behind them. Alyssa turned her head and smiled. The gentlemen passengers had come to join the party, with the ship's boy, Davies, bringing up the rear. She wondered whose idea the dinner invitation was. Some of the girls already limped a little. After less than a quarter of a mile, they hadn't been able to walk much during their long sea voyage in cramped conditions. At least this path was smooth, with the solid earth baked hard. A few buildings made of rough timber or stone lined the port, probably the workspace of clerks, or for the storage of goods, Alyssa guessed. She wished that she could stroll around and explore this new place. Mr. Kendrick and Matron stopped in front of a low-slung building with a porch running along one side. It appeared new, with the timber barely weathered. While her friends entered the hotel in silent awe, Alyssa took stock of her surroundings. It was rustic but pleasant, she decided. She noticed with delight the dancing fingers of light on the scrubbed floorboards. The window panes gleamed and the brass lantern fittings shone. The main bar offered space for at least 24 men side by side, while half a dozen small tables with chairs scattered around them waited for customers. Mr. Kendrick led them through the door into another room, this one with a large unlit fireplace at the end and a chandelier furnished with dozen tallow candles. 2 long tables were already waiting for them. With Captain Moore at the head of one, the gentleman sat down next to him. Mr. Kendrick led Matron to the other table and installed himself at the head. Alyssa craned her neck. Where was the doctor? Your beau is missing, Susanna said. The doctor is not my beau. Then how come you know who I meant? Susanna winked at her. Everyone can see that he likes you. Too bad for our Canadian friends. She lifted her skirt to sit down with Alyssa next to her. Alyssa couldn't suppress a smile. Susanna didn't know Alyssa's secret, that she'd never intended to marry one of the men who awaited them several days' travel up the Fraser River. For her new friends, this opportunity to exchange poverty in Melbourne for a prosperous life in Canada offered everything they wished for. But Alyssa, with her private means as the orphaned daughter of a high-ranking civil servant, had other plans with her life. All she wanted was a chance to secure a passage to go back home to the England she'd left as a 2-year-old. As much as she hated lying to everyone, this bridal voyage had been her only opportunity to secure a berth. No shipping agent would have sold a ticket to a single lady without a proper chaperone. At least now she'd half to the distance, and as soon as the girls were settled in, she and Matron Mackenzie would book 2 berths on the next ocean-going ship. With Matron as her companion, no one would deny her ticket that a single lady could not obtain. A tiny doubt crept up into her mind that the pretty young widow might have other plans, but she shut it out. Susanna nudged her and nodded towards the entrance. Dr. Bryson stood there, with a heavy leather briefcase in one hand and the other smoothing his dark blonde hair. He strolled over to Alyssa's table. Over here, Bryson, Mr. Kendrick said. The doctor gave Alyssa an apologetic shrug that she ignored for her companion's sake. Sorry it took me so long, Captain Moore. He put the briefcase next to him on the bench as he took his place. The captain gave him a curt nod. That's all right. Is everyone here? Mr. Wainwright is still missing, Mr. Kendrick said. A faint tinge of color spread over Matron's cheeks. Rosie, who, as usual, was made to sit beside Matron to be kept in check, snickered. The second officer's affection for Matron and her feelings towards him had long since ceased to be a secret, but only Rosie would make fun of it. Matron slapped her hand with a fan. Her brittle blonde charge poked out her tongue. She's getting meaner and meaner every day. Waif like Nancy, at not yet 18, the youngest of the girls said. She should be thankful the captain didn't clap her bow and irons when he caught them together. She told me they'll leave here, said Nellie, the closest to a friend that Rosie possessed. She said he's going to marry her and she'll live in a fancy house. And I'll be the queen, Hannah said. The other girls laughed. They'd all suffered under Rosie's vicious tongue. Alyssa hoped, for Rosie's sake, that the stoker kept his word and regularized their relationship, but she had her doubts. Two boys entered through a swing door behind a wooden bar and set down platters with ham, fish, boiled potatoes, and freshly baked bread. A plump woman in a spotless cotton frock with a starched pinafore supervised their effort. Alyssa took her for their mother. The door swung open, and Mr. Wainwright rushed in, a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. Please excuse my tardiness, Captain, he said as he motioned Rosie to give up her place to him. She did so with her customary scowl, but surprisingly no protest. The captain lifted his bushy eyebrows. I'm sure you had a reason. Now let's say grace. The food disappeared in record time, but the two boys competed to replace empty platters at a staggering speed. They ate like they hadn't done in weeks, since the last fresh victuals arrived during their stop in San Francisco. After all the salted meat and hard biscuits on board, it was heaven to have meat, crusty bread, pale yellow butter, creamy and shaped into a mold, fish from the very day's catch, and a pie bursting with apple with cream slathered on top. Even the gentlemen concentrated on their plates. The landlady beamed in good humor as she watched them enjoy every morsel of her home cooking. After the pie, a reverent silence set in until Mr. Wainwright tapped his spoon against his glass, beer for the men, water for the girls, and stood up. He picked up the bouquet he'd kept in a glass of water all during their dinner, and with his other hand clasped Mrs. Mackenzie's. Their gaze met for an exquisitely tender look as she took the wildflowers from him and sniffed their soft fragrance. I would like to extend on Captain Moore's well wishes, he said. Had our kind passengers not beaten me to this celebratory dinner, I would have issued this invitation. He raised his mug. Luckily for me, none of them beat me in another matter. I'm happy to tell you that Matron Mackenzie has consented to do me the honor to become my wife. Mr. Kendrick jumped up and clapped him on the shoulder. Well done, you sly fox. He dashed over to Matron, grabbed her by the shoulders, and bestowed a hearty kiss on her cheek. Dr. Bryson followed suit to the flustered delight of a blushing matron and applause from everyone else except the groom. That's enough, he said. Please unhand my bride. He's right, Bryson, said Kendrick. When we're on land, it's every man for himself. The doctor gave Alyssa a quick glance. Susanna nudged her again. The wedding will be tomorrow on board, said Mr. Wainwright, before this kind lady and I will escort our other brides to be to their new home. He bent over Matron's hand and pressed a kiss on it. Alyssa and the other girls broke into wild applause. Matron blinked away happy tears. She fumbled for her reticule. Mr. Osborne, a shy banker and a hobby astronomer, came to her rescue. He offered her a snowy handkerchief to dab her eyes with. I wish you all the happiness in the world, he said, both of you. Aye, the captain raised his glass. A toast to the best second officer I've sailed with. If you do half as well as a husband, of which I have no doubt, Matron can consider herself a very lucky woman. To Mr. Wainwright and Matron, Mr. Kendrick echoed. Alyssa wished for something a bit more suitable for a toast than water, but she could imagine the scandal had she asked for a bottle of sherry, if hotels in Canada offered sherry at all. She sipped her water, as did the other girls and the bride. The captain said, It's time to return to our chambers. Rosie snickered again, but this time got no reaction. Matron made a radiant bride, despite the lack of a wedding dress. Nancy spent all morning trimming Matron's blue woolen dress with a lace collar that Alyssa had gotten in San Francisco as a present, while Hannah brushed the bride's hair and put it up in a bun at the back with soft ringlets framing the face. Davy stood by, ready to run any errand needed. Alyssa marveled at his boundless enthusiasm to pick up a dropped pin or fetch warm water and a heated iron. She also envied him, his patience with enforced idleness. He didn't mind standing in wait for half an hour at a time until he could make himself useful again. Lucky boy, she thought. Apart from donating the collar, Alyssa found herself, for once, helpless of assisting any further. She lacked Hannah's hairdressing skills, and her sewing, though adequate, could not match Nancy's. She finally decided to ask Susanna to help her with the packing of the girls' meager belongings, but first she needed the list she had compiled for each of them. Davy, she asked, can you spare me a few minutes to accompany me to the office? That is, unless he's needed here, matron. Don't move, ma'am. Hannah curled a strand of hair around a heated tongue. Matron fluttered her hand in a gesture of permission. We'll be back as soon as possible, Alyssa said. The office was barely a few hundred yards away, but by captain's orders, no female was permitted to walk around unaccompanied, to keep them safe from unwanted attention. Alyssa raised a hand to knock at the office door, but raised voices made her stop at the last instant. As soon as the wedding vows have been exchanged, I want you off my ship, Captain Moore said. A high-pitched voice answered, well, my fiancé and I will be happy to be rid of this stinking hull and of you and that stupid woman lording it over us. Davies and Alyssa drew in their breath in unison. Rosie, of course. Out with both of you. I give you 10 minutes to collect your sorry things, and if you, my man, expect a character reference from me. Alyssa and Davies fled round a corner as Rosie and a stocky man with soot ingrained in his cheeks and hands stomped out of the office. Davies, the captain sounded as he was half choked. The boy rushed towards the captain, as did Alyssa, who collided with the doctor as he left his surgery. I'm sorry, she said, but his mind was already on his patient. He grabbed the captain's wrist, counting under his breath. Captain Moore's face was purple with rage, but he had already calmed down. The captain shook the doctor off. I'm fine, he said. You, sir, better spend your time looking after Mr. Wainwright, bound to get jittery on such a day. And you, Davies, make sure that those two troublemakers don't take a single thing that doesn't belong to them. He spotted Alyssa. What is it that you want now? The inventory lists, sir, she said. If Davies and I have those, we can assure that Rosie's box contains nothing apart from the items it should. The captain nodded. He reached for a ledger. Alyssa watched with dismay as Rosie stuffed her few shabby clothes into her box. True, she'd caused nothing but trouble, but casting off all her ties to the other brides would leave her at the mercy of the stoker. Alyssa pulled out her own luggage and dragged it behind a partition to hide her actions from curious eyes. She opened the secret drawer and took out a velvet pouch. Coins clinked softly as she selected one. She stowed the pouch away, closed the drawer, and restored her trunk to its place. Rosie? The girl scowled at her. What do you want, Miss Toffee Nose? Alyssa's resolve shrunk to a pinhead size. But her conscience told her that she couldn't let Rosie go without any means to escape. Take this, she said, holding out a gold half-eagle. Rosie gaped at the coin. She grabbed it and dropped it inside her shift. $5. You must be filthy rich. A slow, for once real smile curled up at the corners of her mouth. You're not such a cow after all, are you? Please take care of yourself, Rosie. And if you're ever in trouble, you know where to find the girls. Rosie shrugged. I don't think so, I'm sure. She felt for the coin. I'd better be off. The fiancé is waiting. She snapped her fingers at Davies. You can take my box now. Davies has got other things to do, Alyssa said, but we will see you to your cabin. Rosie narrowed her eyes at Alyssa. Her moment of gratefulness obviously passed. I'm not sticking around to see the old trout hitched. If you wish, it was probably for the best, Alyssa thought. With Rosie gone, nobody could spoil the happiness of this day.